Our second reading this morning comes from the Gospel according to St. Luke, the 19th chapter, beginning with the first verse. This is a familiar story. If you have been at Bible school or in Sunday school in your childhood or youth, you will know this story. The problem with stories that we know too well is that we don't listen to them when we hear them again. So it takes a special effort to listen for the Word of God. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through it. A man there named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was rich. He was trying to see who Jesus was. But on account of the crowd, he could not because he was short in stature. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see Jesus because he was going to pass that way. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and he said to him, "Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today." So he hurried down and was happy to welcome Jesus. All who saw it began to grumble, of course, and said, "He has gone to be the guest of one who is a sinner." Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, "Look, half of my possessions, Lord, I will give to the poor, and if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay back 4 times as much." And then Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because Zacchaeus too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek out and to save the lost." May God add a blessing to this reading of the Word. Ancient words, ever true, changing me and changing you. We have come with open hearts. Oh, let the ancient words impart. My good friend from high school, his name is Larry Hattrick. He was a poet in high school, a writer, an artist, a sensitive soul, and also a computer programmer. And when he left high school and college, he went on to join the ranks of the IRS. He never touched anyone's tax forms. He never had to say bad news to anyone. He just worked on the computer programs that the IRS used. But he always used to say that it was amazing to him how much friendlier people were to him after April 15th than they were before April 15th. Because nobody thinks about taxes or those who have to collect them in a very friendly way when you are pulling out your hair and sharpening your pencil and beating your head against the desk trying to figure out what it all means. And that's in a society where taxes are determined by elected representatives, and when we are all paying according to a law which, while hard to understand sometimes, is in fact right before us. So remember Larry Hattrick, especially this time of year. At the close of World War II in France, as the Allies moved through France and the Germans thankfully left Paris as an open city so that it wasn't
destroyed by war. And as they retreated to the Rhine, French people began to identify who were the young women who had fraternized and been in special friendships with German officers and soldiers. And when they were identified, they were dragged out into the street and their hair was cut off short. Now, in the early part of the 20th century, that can be a fashion statement of a sort, but in the middle of the 20th century in France, a woman's glory was her hair. It was a way of humiliating someone who was, in fact, a traitor. Because in 1939, when the Germans came marching in, they looked like a permanent fixture. It was easy to believe in the myth of the Thousand-Year Reich. But 4 years later, the Thousand-Year Reich was a shambles, and these women had made the wrong choice, and they were paying for it. And they paid for it pretty much for the rest of their lives. They were humiliated. They were abused. They were hated. They were held in contempt. When we were in Sunday school, those of us who were, when we were in vacation Bible school, we learned a song about Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus was a wee little man was he. He camped in the sycamore tree, the Lord he wanted to see. Savior passed that way, up in the street. Zacchaeus, you come down to your house today. I didn't expect we would sing the whole song. That's a sweet little song, and we still teach it to kids because Zacchaeus, being a short guy, kids can relate to him, and the fact that Jesus welcomes him, that's all good for Vacation Bible School. But if you really want to understand who Zacchaeus was and what his experience with Jesus was, you would do better to look to the experience of those women in Paris at the close of the Second World War. Because he was not like Larry Hattrick, just a guy working for the government to do a job that we all had agreed needed to be done, no matter how distasteful it was. And even Larry experienced the fact that people weren't as friendly towards him during tax season as they were when it wasn't tax season. Zacchaeus was a traitor to his people. His job was to collect the taxes not for the homegrown government elected by everyone, or even the homegrown government overseen by a monarch of their people. It was the taxes that were owed to the Roman Empire, which had brutally oppressed them, had taken away their sovereignty, was assaulting their national identity, was just by their presence in their midst humiliating them. And that's just if Zacchaeus were just a regular old tax collector. Because tax collectors made their living not by drawing a salary from the government, they made their living by taking a percentage of what they charged people before they passed it on to the government. And there weren't any really well-defined or well-overseen limits to how much that percentage could be. So people hated regular old tax collectors because they were traitors. They were people who were working for the conqueror, for the oppressor. But Zacchaeus wasn't just an ordinary tax collector. He was a chief tax collector. He skimmed stuff off the top of the people who came, of the regular tax collectors, causing them to skim more money off of just regular people. He was a chief collaborator. He was a chief traitor to the people. And if they could have gotten away with it, they would have shaved his head. They would have humiliated him. They couldn't get away with that. But you can imagine what his life was like. You can imagine the sort of people who were willing to invite Zacchaeus to their house. You can imagine how many people spit at his feet on their way by, just passing in public. Now, he was rich. Luke tells us he was rich, and I'm sure that there was some comfort in being able to own a nice house and have some servants and wear good clothes. But I'm not sure that made up for being scorned and hated by your own people. Try to imagine what that would be like. To know what people were saying behind your back. That's who Zacchaeus is. He's hated by the people who ought to love him. And he has no one to blame for it but himself. It's probably not just because he was short that he couldn't make his way to the front of the crowd to see Jesus either. Probability is that people were pretty careful not to let him be able to poke through to see what he wanted to see. That's who Zacchaeus was. Wee little man or not, he was not a happy guy. And he sort of deserved what he got. Luke tells us that this unhappy outcast, rich though he may have been, went when he heard that Jesus was passing through his town of Jericho. He went because he wanted to know who this Jesus was. He didn't go because he wanted to worship Jesus. He didn't want to go because he wanted to be Jesus' disciple. But he'd heard about Jesus. And he wanted to know more. He wanted to know who Jesus was. And all he wanted to do on that particular day was to see him. Because he'd heard about it. Maybe he'd heard that Levi was one of his chief followers and that Levi was a tax collector. Maybe he'd heard that Jesus was willing to touch the unclean, and certainly if he was willing to touch a leper, whose fingers might have been falling off or whose nose might have been only partially there, certainly he might be willing to touch him, to see him. We all want to be seen, right? We all hate being invisible. And I imagine if you're a really short person, I won't call out any names, but you must be especially desirous of being seen, of not falling behind, into the crevices and the shadows. So he goes and he can't get in front of the crowd to see, so he gets an idea and he runs through Mrs. McGillicuddy's backyard and then through the playground at the elementary school and across the street and over the intersection and through the parking lot of the 7-Eleven, and he gets to that big sycamore tree that's right in the yard next door because he figures Jesus has got to go out of town. If he's going to Jerusalem, he's got to go out on Route 33, and so he's going to pass that way. And he climbs the tree and he waits. And Jesus, with this huge crowd following him, people at the side of the road acclaiming him and wanting just to get a glimpse of this guy they've heard so much about, and all of Jesus' entourage and followers, Jesus comes under the branch where Zacchaeus is, and then he stops. And then the most amazing thing, he stops and he says, Zacchaeus, hurry, come down, because I got to stay at your house. Zacchaeus is seen. He is seen. And Jesus' response to him, even though he hasn't said anything to Jesus, even though he hasn't been introduced to Jesus, Jesus has seen him hanging from the branch. Jesus knows his name. Zacchaeus isn't necessarily famous, but Jesus knows his name. And Jesus, in a way that is so obviously amused and affectionate says, Zacchaeus, hurry, come down, because I'm coming to your house. I'm going to stay with you today. Here's this outcast. Here's this person that everyone despises. Here's this person who feels invisible both because he's short and because nobody wants to see him. Even the people who know his name don't use it. They use other words to describe him. Jesus knows his name, uses his name, and invites him. Nothing happens between Jesus and Zacchaeus. Nothing happens between Jesus and Zacchaeus except that Zacchaeus wants to know who Jesus is. And Jesus knows his name and invites himself to Zacchaeus' house. But really it's Zacchaeus who's being invited out of his old identity into his new one. But there is no apology. There's no repentance. There's no miracle. There's no teaching. It is that Zacchaeus wants to know who Jesus is. And Jesus invites him to know who he is. Something almost invisible, something almost, you'd say, small, and yet in Zacchaeus' life, huge, happened between those two realities. And at Zacchaeus' house later, Zacchaeus says, Lord, I will pay back I will pay back anything that I owe to somebody many times over. If I have defrauded somebody, and he doesn't say that he has, maybe he hasn't. Maybe everyone just assumes he does because he's so rich and because of what he does for a living. But he says, if I have, I will pay it 4 times or 5 times over. The Jewish law requires, if you have defrauded somebody and you admit to it, if you turn yourself in, you have to pay back what you defrauded plus 20%. That's what Leviticus says. If you get caught defrauding somebody and you don't turn yourself in, you don't admit to it, then you have to pay 4 and 5 times what you owe. So what he's offering to do is way beyond what even the law requires of him. I will give half of what I have, says Zacchaeus, to the poor. He's not doing that as a way to get saved. He's doing that in a just kind of an explosive, intuitive, emotional response to the thing which has happened to him with Jesus. His salvation has been created in that spark between his longing to know who Jesus is and Jesus knowing his name and inviting him. There's no reward here. There's no punishment here. There's no buying of favors here. In the instant that Jesus invites himself to Zacchaeus' house, Zacchaeus is saved. He's saved because of his longing, his emptiness, his need. And he's saved because Jesus looked at him hanging from that branch and smiled at his desperation and smiled at his pain, smiled with love and desire to call him home. That is the very essence of the gospel of Jesus Christ. That in that place where our longing, where our need, where our shame, where our traitorousness intersects with the loving invitation of a God who loved us all along in spite of all that stuff, where those two things intersect, our salvation is created. Each of the characters that we've met along this journey during Lent, once we've looked at them, have turned out not to be strangers on the road. They turned out to be us. In each case, we've seen our own faces reflected in theirs. In each case, we've seen not only how God, Jesus, intersects with them and calls them into new life, but we've seen how it is that Jesus comes upon us, discovers us, calls us into new life with him. Calls each of them and each of us to follow him on the road to Jerusalem. The road that leads to his final sacrifice and his final act of self-giving love. Follow him to stand at the foot of the cross while he suffers in our place, the suffering that we, in fact, incurred and deserved. Each of them and each of us are invited by him. Follow him to Jerusalem, not just to the cross, but beyond it, to the door of the empty tomb, where we will encounter his resurrection, but more importantly,